Bingo. And good afternoon or evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to Two Guys in a Bible on Fulfilled Radio, a voice you can trust. And Daniel is not able to be with me this evening. He is with his church group, with the young people of a church group, and they went on a camping trip or something like that. And super glad to note that my good friend William Bell is back with us. William, great to see you again.
Thank you, Don. It's good to be back with you and hope you're doing well. Hope that Jan is doing well. I know I got some reports that she's had some issues, and even you, I thought, but I know you traveled a little bit recently,
Yep.
but looks like you're doing pretty good. You sound great.
Yeah, I feel better today than I have in a while. Had a really, really super tough time filming this morning. But, Jan and I both came down with a respiratory infection, a really bad one, almost a month ago now. And we still, both of us have got a little bit of residual hangover from it. But anyway, how's your family?
Everybody's doing fine, and just been having a ball with the great grandbaby, trying to get her to walk up and down the stairs using the rail. She finally did it today.
There you go.
She'll crawl up to the top, and then when she gets to the top, she wants us to pick her up and bring her back down. So I forced her to come down with the rail, and she finally did it today 2 or 3 times. So I'm really proud of her progress.
You bet.
Yeah, I've had some back issues. I don't know whether it's sciatic nerve or what, but it's just been real painful. And but other than that, I mean, I'm fine. I'd like to blew my muscles out trying to lift some weights and exercise a little bit. But so I'm waiting on recovery so I can get back to that.
I have become a firm believer that exercise is bad for your health.
Well, I labored under that philosophy for a long time before I started doing
it. Well, William, you recently returned from another trip to Ghana. Why don't you give us a kind of a thumbnail sketch of how things went over there and what you were hoping to accomplish and what you did accomplish?
Yeah, well, things went well. I had a lot of loose ends to tie for the most part that were even unrelated to ministry. And it took a while to get those done, having to go back from one place to the other. But I did spend time with Solomon, and I preached that Sunday morning. I think it was the 8th of October. Had a good message from them, and then I got word back from the congregation that they really enjoyed the message. I think we did something. Solomon had been teaching on No More Tears, and so he wanted me to do something along that line. And so I did a study, and about a week later, or maybe even after I got back home, I got a message saying that the congregation really enjoyed that. And that's positive. It's always good to, get some feedback from people. Because sometimes, when you're teaching, you never know what impact you're having or how good you're doing or whatever. And so to get some feedback is very important. That night we went to the radio station, which is on a technical college campus, I believe it is. And so we did another study, and Solomon told me that there's a guy from the Church of Christ, I believe it is, pretty prominent guy, who calls all of the preachers that he knows and tells them that the heretic is now on the air. And so Solomon says he does that every time, he comes on. And so that night, of course, I was on, and Solomon, translated. It was funny because Leora said, William, you talk, there were times or two, how these translations go, right? You talk, and then you wait for him to translate. And sometimes it seems like, when he's translating, you're sitting there saying, did I say all of that? Because he's talking a long time to try to get it all.
He's talking this long.
yeah, to say it. And then there were times when I noticed that I did speak a long time, and I'm wondering if he could remember all that. So we laughed a couple of times, because when I finished, I looked at him, and he's okay. It's like, do I have to remember how to say all of this? But anyway, all these phones start ringing as soon as I get on the air. And let me turn these off. Sorry about that, ladies and gentlemen. But okay. Anyway, so following that, after we did the program, or while we were doing the program, we got a call from this guy. And he asked the question on the air, which I addressed, and then after the broadcast, he sent a written question, which I didn't get a chance to respond to until I got back. I told Solomon I would respond to it, but it was a little bit lengthy question, and so I wrote him a response and sent it back to him. But the feedback that I got from Solomon was that he really, really appreciated hearing from me. He said, "Wow," he said, "the guy speaks with a lot of confidence." And he says, and Solomon said he told him that he liked me. So that was positive.
Yeah.
And so I don't know whether that's going to open up some doors. It possibly will. And I'm looking, forward to hearing more from the outcome of that as we continue. We also, shared some funds with Solomon because he's trying to get a building done. They're still using that school, and it's not very much room in there, and it sort of hinders the attendance that they have. But we took him a pretty decent contribution this time, and we'd already sent some funds before, so now I think he's going to get the building underway and really start making some good progress. And once that happens, his building is sitting right off the road, so there's a lot of traffic going by, and I think that's going to be very good for him and for the growth. And I know that people once they see it there, he'll probably pick up. The congregation will probably pick up, quite well. And so we did some other studies as well in the Volta region, and that turned out well. Also, those brothers want us to come back and do some more teaching. And so it looks like it's going to be good. As a matter of fact, they even want to start a new congregation out in that area. But they had a lot of flooding out there. I think in Burkina Faso, they opened a dam to the Volta River. And I tell you, it looked almost like Katrina in some of the pictures. Now, I didn't see everything out there, but with some of the pictures that I was sent, the water, like the mud huts, were just washed away in many of the areas. And the water was up to above the windows on the houses. And it was tough. And then as we were driving down the main street in Avieme, you could see in the backyards and in the front yards, you could see the water. And we went to lunch at a hotel there, and they have a little outside resort area where, and I had visited that hotel before, but they have an outside resort area. And then there's a little lower, decline, I guess you could say, where it kind of tapers off, and that was just full of water. So on both sides of the street, you could see it, and it was really tragic because they were kind of frantically getting water and resources to get to the people who were without access, and a lot of the people were just stranded from their homes. And this is still going on. As a matter of fact, I heard that one of the people were trying to get it declared a disaster area, and I don't know what the outcome of that has been, but we didn't spend a lot of time there because of that.
Wow. That's horrific. But it sounds like you had a very good, fruitful trip, and that's always a good thing.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, I'll very quickly give a little bit of a update on my weekend. Jan and I traveled to Conroe, Texas, to an automotive swap meet last week, but I had received an invitation to speak at Huntsville, Texas, and there's a small group of people there, 10 to 12, perhaps another one or two, that are part of a larger congregation. And what's interesting is they have their own class. They're at the church building, and they're free to teach covenant eschatology in that class. I spoke there last year, and they found out I was going to be there at the swap meet again this year. The swap meet's about 30 miles south of the congregation. And so they asked me to speak there, and I was more than glad to do. I had a wonderful, wonderful time of fellowship with that group down there. Just a really, really a dedicated group of folks that come from every kind of background that you can imagine, but they've come to the truth of covenant eschatology, and they're courageous enough to invite me in. They may be facing some difficulties. One of the men, who is just, wow, he's just an outstanding guy, extremely well read. He was nominated to be an elder in that church. I don't even know the name of the church, to be honest about it. I didn't pay attention to it as we drove in, but nonetheless, he was nominated to be an elder, and the rest of the elders, except one, declined. They wouldn't accept him because of his views on eschatology. And so probably some trouble ahead in the future, because he is so extremely highly respected in the congregation. So for him to be rejected by the other elders because of that, yet he's so popular in the congregation, they may be facing some issues in the very near future. So, but it was a great time. We just had a great time down there.
Yeah, well, that's good. You know, that situation sounds almost like one we have in Tennessee in the congregation that's much farther east than where I am. But there was a guy who's an elder in the church, very popular, did a lot of teaching, very positive on covenant eschatology, but the majority of the elders, and he served as an elder, by the way, and but the majority of them decided to sort of boot him out in some way or another, or he just got frustrated and stopped. But that's happening, and it continues to happen. But you know, progress is still being made, and so I'm really, really grateful for that. And but it sounds like you had a good time, and some fruit is coming out of that, and it's very good.
Yeah. Well, I tell you what, William, we have Daniel and I have been talking about the Messianic temple, as you know, and we had begun a discussion of Second Corinthians. Now we want to wind up in 2 Corinthians chapter 6, but we've been trying to impress upon the audience of how the New Testament doctrine of the Messianic temple is taken directly from the Old Covenant prophecies of the Messianic temple. And what's interesting to me is I have been doing a series of videos. I've done 38. I will air a 39th this upcoming Friday in a response to Steve Gregg's book, Why Not Full Preterism? And Steve says that one of his objections to full preterism, and specifically to me, he mentions me by name 140 times in his book. So, so nonetheless, one of his specific concerns and objections is, well, Don Preston tells us that the resurrection, the time of the end, is all taken from based upon Israel's feast days, and specifically the last feast day of Sukkot. Now, I don't know if you've seen the announcement or not, but thank the good Lord, I'm just sky high about this. My brand new book, Resurrection Feast Fulfilled, a study of the relationship between Sukkot and the resurrection, it will be formally introduced in the morning on my morning musing. So I'm super thrilled about that. So everyone can watch my morning musings in the morning. It'll be posted on Facebook, et cetera, et cetera. So anyway, the point that I make in this book is that Steve's objection to the truth that Paul's entire eschatology, Peter's eschatology, John's eschatology, is nothing other than that which was taught by the law and the prophets. And Steve argues in his book, well, Preston's just simply wrong on this, because Paul taught lots of things that are not found in the Old Testament. Yeah. And the resurrection could have been, Sukkot could have been related to the fulfillment of Israel's history, having nothing to do with the end of time and the end of the Christian age. So this is how Steve and some others deals with the issue of the Messianic temple. Well, that's all about Israel, but we're looking, the church is looking forward to the end of time, the end of the Christian age. So again, Daniel and I have been trying to impress upon our audience of how critically important it is to see the promise of the Messianic temple as the promise made to Old Covenant Israel. The Messianic temple being the church, the body of Christ, the church of the living God, if you please, Hebrews chapter 12, 21 and following. So, William, why don't we touched on, we did not go into great detail, but we want to cover Ezekiel chapter 37 as the foundational text for Paul's doctrine of the Messianic temple in 2 Corinthians chapter 6. But I know that you and I have done, both of us have done an awful lot of study on Ezekiel 37 as it relates to 2 Corinthians 3 through 6 and actually into chapter 7. Why don't you give us just a thumbnail sketch of the elements of Ezekiel 37 and how it relates to 2 Corinthians chapters 3 through 6?
Okay, well, thanks. I'll do my best to sum this up a little bit. Well, the first thing that we see in Ezekiel 37 is a resurrection motif with the Valley of Dry Bones. And of course, he says this is the whole house of Israel, and it was going to be through the Spirit that they would be raised. And obviously, this is not a literal biological resurrection here. This is the restoration of Israel to their land, and it's possibly the reason why they have the opinion that resurrection had to do with bringing Israel back into the physical land. Maybe that undergirds a part of that. The second major theme in Ezekiel 37 is the regathering of Judah and Israel, the two sticks prophecy. And so that they would be gathered together in one. And I know some years ago, you and what's the name of the gentleman that passed from North Carolina, who had the radio program?
Oh, John Anderson.
Yeah. John Anderson. Yeah. You did the book, The Last Days, with him. I know that you all had done quite a bit of teaching on that, showing a correlation between Ezekiel 37 and Ephesians 2. But that's the second part, which is the regathering. And so you kind of have these two themes woven in together, where you're dealing with the resurrection motif and bringing Israel back into their land, the gathering with the two sticks. And then, of course, in the latter part of the chapter, the bringing all of them under the one servant David, and then making the covenant of peace, and also establishing his sanctuary among them, which, of course, would be the temple. So all of these things go hand in hand. The regathering of Israel, the resurrection, and the Messianic temple are all found right here in Ezekiel 37, and that becomes the basis for Paul's discussion, as you indicated before, in 2 Corinthians chapters 3 through, I'd take it all the way to 7:1 at least, in terms of the background for that text. And it's just amazing how so many people do not see that. They run right past these chapters and the significance of them in relating to that, to make the application of the resurrection of the new temple, the Messianic temple. And they totally ignore, and this boggles my mind, they seem to totally ignore the temple that was being built in the time of the apostles' ministry, and then go beyond that after the Jerusalem temple was destroyed, the temple in Jerusalem, and look for one way beyond the time frame, which is what you were suggesting a moment ago, because they're trying to place this at the end of time, the alleged end of time, and take it completely out of the apostolic time frame. So hopefully that serves as a bit of a summary from my point of view, and I'm sure you have more details that you'd like to include there as well.
Well, you said, you made a comment there, it kind of boggles your mind. That's a good that's a good expression, because when I look at the profound impact of Ezekiel 37 on 2 Corinthians chapters 3 through, and like you said, into chapter 7 verse 1, how in the world we as modern Bible students can completely overlook those incredible connections. And now last week I did touch on the fact, and you touched on it here a little bit, and that's the resurrection motif. Mm-hmm. John Levinson, Levinson in his book on the resurrection says that originally in Hebraic thought, resurrection was not of the individual, it was corporate, and it had to do with Israel being returned from bondage, whether that was Assyrian or Babylonian, and being returned to the land in fellowship with God. That was the original concept of resurrection. And he specifically points to Ezekiel 37. Well, how you could get anything else out of that is a mystery to me, to be honest about it. It's very clear, it's very graphic and explicit. These bones represent the whole house of Israel in bondage, in captivity. Now, it says they're in the graves, to be sure, but the graves are their captivity. And
yes,
go ahead. Yeah.
You know, that theme and motif runs not only in Ezekiel 37, but as you and I have discussed in time past, and you know, I did that chart on this concept a couple of years ago, where it's the same theme in Isaiah, it's the same thing in Hosea, in Jeremiah and Daniel. They all use the same motifs. They were all pretty much prophesying similar events with Israel, and of course with Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Daniel. They all had the same experience in Babylon. So why would they come out with 2 or 3 different concepts on dwelling in the dust, rising out of the graves, etc., and considering that resurrection when that was their experience? I just, you know, again, as I said before, just really is a confusing concept to try to separate, dichotomize, and eliminate that motif of dwelling in the dust, or as the Bible metaphorically uses it, the graves, and then make it mean something other than that.
Yeah, and what's interesting to me, there's a growing number of Bible commentators who agreeing even that Daniel chapter 12 is metaphoric. It's,
yes.
You know, Kenneth Gentry is a prime example of this, and sometimes it almost feels like we're picking on Kenneth, but he's an easy target, so sorry. But in his earlier works, The Greatness of the Great Commission, for instance, Kenneth Gentry says on Daniel chapter 12, verse 2, the only thing in the dust is physical graves. And Daniel chapter 12, verse 2 is a prediction of the resurrection at the end of the current Christian age. Well, in his later work of the great, He Shall Have Dominion, yeah, almost lost it there, in his 2009 volume, guess what he does? He says, well, Daniel chapter 12, verse 2 is actually a depiction of Israel, corporate Israel, in bondage to sin, alienated from God, but is depicted as in the graves, in the dust, but resurrected and transformed into the spiritual body of Christ. And you're going, whoa, that's awesome. Well said, Mr. Gentry.
Yeah. And sometimes they say it so well when they articulate it. I mean, it's like, man, I'd like to use his, copy his.
I'm going to use that. And by the way, Steve Gregg, in the book that I mentioned earlier, Why Not Full Preterism,
mm-hmm.
he acknowledges that the traditional creedal view is that Daniel chapter 12, verse 2 does in fact refer to biological resurrection at the end of time. But he said, I don't believe that's accurate. Now, a little bit of a note here. On the one hand, Steve Gregg castigates those of us who are full preterists for abandoning consensus of scholarship. You know, we reject the creeds and reject the majority of scholarship. Then he turns right around and says, now I acknowledge that the consensus of scholarship is Daniel chapter 12, verse 2 is the end of time. But he said, I reject that. Oh, so you're allowed to do it, but we're not.
Yeah.
That's,
you know, just to add a little balance there, because I know you talked about Kenneth Gentry, you know, from the Reformed community, but I don't know if you remember some years ago with the Bellevue Church of Christ, where Hoger had the debate with Daniel Denham.
Yes.
Glenn Hitchcock, who was he was a first-year student when I was a second-year student in the Memphis School of Preaching. Well, he got up and just told the brothers, you know, and you know how adamant and vehement they were against us.
Yes.
And our view of the resurrection occurring in 70 AD, and particularly Daniel. But he says, brethren, he says, look, he says, I don't care what you're saying. He said, this is not a physical body resurrection. This took place in 70 AD. It's in harmony with Matthew 24. And he cited the text. And I'm saying, here they are with a guy telling them this. And yet he's in full fellowship. Yep. You know, he's, you know, just A-okay with them. And yet he's on one of their passages, you know, that they consider to be such a strong text for future physical body resurrection. Yep. He says, no, it's not so. So there you go, from even the amillennialist camp as well.
Yeah. And it's refreshing to see more and more commentators taking the view. N.T. Wright sort of, to me, equivocates on Daniel chapter 12. He indicates that what it's about is vindication of the martyrs. Well, that doesn't necessitate coming out of the ground.
Mm-hmm.
And he knows that. He acknowledges, for instance, that the martyrs were vindicated in AD 70 in the destruction of Jerusalem. Okay, so that doesn't mean that all the martyrs were raised out of the ground. It means that their cause was vindicated. So on the one hand, N.T. Wright understands the concept of martyr vindication as resurrection. And on the other hand, he seems to indicate on Daniel chapter 12 that, well, maybe it is physical bodies. But he never just comes down hard and fast, unless I missed it. I know one thing that he does do. He completely 100% ignores Daniel chapter 12, verse 7 as the time for the fulfillment of Daniel chapter 12, verse 2. Not a word. He wrote a book that big, The Resurrection of the Son of Man.
I've got it.
Yeah, I know you do. And so here he expounds on the vindication of the martyrs, resurrection in verse 2, time of the end, and then in verse 7, total, absolute silence. Well, how do you do that? So anyway, to move on.
Let me say this while you're on this thought. I know that you like Tom Holland's book Contours in Pauline Theology, and so do I. I happened to be looking over it the other day. My headset is getting caught on something back here, or at least the cord. And I was just going back through some of the material because something came up in one of our classes, and I was reviewing it. So I went back to read through it, and something I had missed, and that was on the word soma, where he said that soma in some of the writings referred to the whole man, and not just a Greek dualism that people generally have. And I said, wow, this is very interesting, because he argues very strongly for the corporate concept of body throughout his book. So I went to look up the reference, and I didn't finish reading all of it, but I'm going to do it. And of course, he was talking about Gundry, who strongly opposes that because of his view. But I thought that was very interesting to see that as well, and I'd like to pursue that a little bit more in terms of discussions.
Yeah. Interestingly enough, I had picked him up again just recently and gone back over some of this stuff, because I have found some of his comments. For instance, his comments on the Akedah, what he calls the Akedah, the sacrifice of Abraham and Isaac in the ancient traditions, and he ties that in with Passover and some other concepts. Very, very fascinating stuff. So, okay. So in Ezekiel chapter 37, we have the promise of the resurrection. And now, folks, we want to tie this in with the Messianic temple, because Ezekiel 37:26, remember that at the time of this resurrection, at the time of the rest of the elements that are in Ezekiel 37, that would be the time in which God said, I will put my tabernacle among them. I will dwell among them. I will be their God, and they shall be my people, and all the nations shall know that I am the Lord. So all of these are interrelated, intertwined concepts and motifs. One of those being, here you have, as William's already pointed out so well, the restoration of Israel to the land, and you have the promise that at that time you have a new covenant. Well, William, don't we have the concept of resurrection and new covenant in 2 Corinthians chapter 3?
Absolutely. In that text, he talks about the ministration of death versus the ministration of life. And he speaks about the new covenant versus the letter. And then that was the hope of that transition out of the ministration of death to the ministration of righteousness or life. And of course, that constitutes covenantal resurrection. Again, I've looked at these concepts over and over again. I'm sure you looked at them over and over again, and you wonder, why is it that people are not seeing that? And not only as it's established in chapter 3, but the thread of thought continues all the way through. The remaining chapters, like chapters 4, chapter 5, chapter 6, and as we said, all the way up to 7:1. But those are covenantal concepts. And I don't want to get ahead of you in terms of where you're going, but that's surely the case in 2 Corinthians chapter 3. You've got covenant, you've got death there, and he calls it the ministration of death, or the ministry of death, and then the ministry of righteousness. And a lot of times people don't recognize that righteousness used in that context is a reference to life.
Absolutely.
It's the life of the age. In Galatians 3:21, for if there had been a covenant or a law, which could have given life, truly righteousness would have been by the law. And another couple of texts I like to connect with that is like Psalm 17 and verse 15, when David says that he would awake in your likeness and would be satisfied when he sees God face in righteousness.
Yes.
Well, that's Daniel 12, and Paul quotes it in 1 Corinthians 15:34, awake to righteousness and do not sin. And so that's the idea. It's an awaking to life, which is righteousness, which the futurists try to make a biological body, and it's just not there.
This brings up a concept that we have when you and I were working together all the time on the program. Daniel and I have already touched on it, and it gets to the concept of how far removed modern Western Bible readers are from the original Hebraic thought. And let me offer this little bit of a caveat, and I don't know if it's a caveat or even a disclaimer, but more of a clarification. People sometimes say, well, look at what the Hebrews of the first century, look at what the Hebrews of the second, third century BC were believing. And I would like to point this out. Yes, it's easy to go to some of those Jewish writings of before the time of Christ, first and second century BC, and find some thoughts there that seem to give credence to a physical resurrection. But here's the problem. Many scholars have pointed this out. This is not a preterist invention. What we're dealing with in those first and second century, first and second century BC Jewish writings are the productions of deeply Hellenized Jews. They are not Jews that are as steeped and indoctrinated in the genuine meaning of the Tanakh as the Jews prior to the first and second centuries. We cannot overlook, and look, I did for years. I did for ages almost, to use that term. I never realized how significant the time of Antiochus Epiphanes was and what a profound impact Antiochus Epiphanes. Now, that goes all the way back, of course, to the 4th century and Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great conquering the Middle East, basically, and his number one goal was to turn the whole world into a model of Grecian thought, Grecian practices, et cetera, et cetera. And that had a profound impact on Israel. And then you come forward to the time of Antiochus Epiphanes and how he did his very dead level best to destroy Judaism. He forbade circumcision. He forbade the observance of Sabbath. Well, guess what? Lots and lots of Jews went along because they didn't want to die.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And he established the gymnasiums in Jerusalem. Well, that was absolutely abhorrent to any, quote, faithful Jew, because in the gymnasium, men fought each other. They participated in the races totally nude. That was the Grecian way of doing it. It was a violation of Torah. But more and more and more, the Jews became acclimated and indoctrinated in the Grecian way of dressing, the Grecian way of talking, the Grecian way of thinking, and the Grecian way of looking at literature. That is where it becomes critical. I have a quote from one scholar, Snyder, I believe is his name. I always have a tough time remembering it. But he makes a comment, and similar comments can be found in N.T. Wright, R.T. France, Scott McKnight, etc. But he makes this comment, but he says, after the gospel began to be preached in the first century and the church began to convert Gentiles, there became an increasing loss of understanding of the Hebraic mindset, the Hebraic literature. Consequently, he says, and I'm paraphrasing here, but consequently, he says, there began to develop the idea that we're supposed to expect a literal end of time, which was never found in the Hebraic scriptures. Folks, think about what a profound statement that is. Here's a scholar, and again, scholars such as Davidson, Wright, and others that I've already mentioned, they say the same identical thing. They even tell us that when we come to the patristics, those early church writers, even the apostolic writers, while they quoted the Hebrew scriptures, guess what they did? They imposed Grecian thought onto the ancient Hebraic scriptures. Now, to think that that hasn't profoundly impacted our world, our understanding of scripture, our understanding of eschatology is really, really naive. And so when we come to these thoughts, like what you touched on a little bit ago there, William, when we come to the thoughts of, oh, they're in the dust. Well, hey, we know what dust is. Anybody that's in the dust is dead. That's not the Hebraic way of thinking. In the ancient, not in the Hellenized Hebraic way of thinking, but in the ancient Old Covenant way of thinking. They're in their graves. Back to the book by Levinson. Levinson says the ancient Hebrews used the term of death and graves in a variety of different ways. Someone that was terminally ill, they're already dead, they're alive. And we see this even in Paul, when Paul's talking about a younger widow, not to be put on the rolls for support because, well, she might go off into immorality and be dead while she lives. That's good Hebraic thought. So it behooves us as good students, when we read passages like Ezekiel 37, instead of doing like our dispensational friends said, well, it says they're in the graves, goes, so therefore there's got to be a resurrection. When Jesus comes to establish the new covenant with Israel and restore them to the land, I mean, after all, it's what it says, they're in the graves. That's not the way the Hebrews thought. So I just wanted to insert that as an important reminder of how important it is to think Hebraically. And I know you do, I do. I get castigated, criticized, and condemned by some former predators. Or you say you think Hebraically. You just emphasize, you talk all the time about thinking like the Hebrews do. Well, I'm not going to make any claim that I'm 100% effective at thinking Hebraically. I wish I knew more, even that the more that I study, but I am studying, and the more that I study, the more I see the difference between the Hebraic thought. And there's some books out on this, that are very, very effective in showing the really stark contrast between the Hebraic way of thinking and the Grecian way of thinking. So your thoughts?
Yeah, well, I think that, and I just wanted to make mention of this, that not so much to call attention to our ages, but
please don't.
But you and I have been around long enough to have seen and to see the shifts in scholarship. In terms of the emphasis that they have placed on Hebraic thought as compared to Greek thought. And when the pendulum was strongly, toward Greek concepts, and now it has moved to Hebraic thought, and of course it's continuing to do so. But that's encouraging, because when you look at where it has been and where it is now, and then just get some idea of where it will possibly be maybe years after we're gone, that's very, very encouraging to see. But yes, that is so very important. And as you were saying, Levinson's book is very good. I would highly recommend anybody to go and read that, so you can get those concepts. Even financial distress. They, like what Job was going through, physical illness, etc. When it was terminal, they considered that as good as dead. Look at Abraham. There's another idea of Hebraic thought: Abraham's body as good as dead, and so all of those were the kind of thoughts. And it's so interesting that when people see the spiritual nature of the resurrection in Scripture, the only concept they can have when they see the time difference between the inauguration and the consummation is they have to change the nature of it. And that's a big issue going on. As a matter of fact, I've got a debate coming up with the gentleman. I'm sure you've seen him on Standing for Truth. So sometime, I think in December, we're supposed to debate some topic on eschatology. I'm not really sure. Donnie just contacted me today, so we can start, getting things together. But I listened to his debate with Tuberville, and that was one of the things that he just kept hammering on. We've got the spiritual, so this has to be the physical. And that's totally opposite of Paul's teaching in 1 Corinthians 15, I think it's 46 or so, yep. But it's totally opposite. But that's one of the major hangups that people have in dealing with that, and not seeing that there's a continuity running between the inaugural and the consummative aspect of that. And it's all because of this Greek thought and influence that people have, and yet they want to claim that we are Platonists. That that's another mind boggler to me.
Amen to that. Okay, so back to Ezekiel chapter 37 and going directly toward the concept of the Messianic temple. Notice that in the day in which God would set up his Messianic temple, God said, I'm going to restore Israel to the land, and I'm going to make a new covenant of peace with them, and with David that shall be their king. Well, okay, so we have land, temple, and new covenant. William, it literally astounded me several years ago to discover that dispensationalists, the hardcore dispensationalists, Thomas Ice is one of them. And as you know, I've debated Thomas Ice 4 times. He won't debate me anymore. But nonetheless, Thomas Ice says that the promised new covenant of Jeremiah 31, 29 to 31 has not been established yet. The gospel is not the promised new covenant at all. And when I read that for the very first time, I'm going, wait a minute. So the gospel is not the promised new covenant of Jeremiah 31. Well, let's see, what was the key feature of the new covenant of Jeremiah 31 supposed to be? I will put my law in their hearts, I will write them in their minds, and their sins and their iniquities will I remember no more. What's the key feature of the new covenant of Jesus Christ? This is my blood of the new covenant, which is shed for many for the remission of sin. I mean, how much clearer, how much more of a perfect harmony can you find?
And that concept is resurrection.
Oh, is it ever? Is it ever? Because it's a covenant of peace. Well, what is separation? What is alienation? It's enmity between God and man. Man being alienated from God. I know a lot of people don't like the term spiritual death. I was reading somebody the other day, and he's a preterist, a pretty well-known preterist, super nice guy. And he said, I hate the term spiritual death. Well, I don't mean by that. You don't mean by that the spirit itself dies. Okay. We're not saying that. We're talking about a spiritual relationship that has been severed. It's alienation and separation from God. That is death in the eyes of God. That's Genesis chapter 2 and 3. In the day you eat, you will surely die. He didn't say you'll become mortal. He did not say your body will begin to deteriorate. In the day you eat, you will surely die.
They didn't die. Did he offer an alternative preference for death as opposed to spiritual that he thought would be a better concept?
I didn't find a term that he felt was more appropriate. And like I say, he's a great guy. You and I both know him, but
Yeah.
I was a little bit taken back by that when he says, I just hate the term spiritual death. Well, I agree that we need to be careful in defining our terms. There's no question about that. We need to be, I call conservative, but make sure that the terms that we're using can be easily understood by people. And I know that you and I have encountered this many, many times when we've used the term spiritual death, and people just jump up and say, oh, you're going to say the spirit died. The spirit can't die. It's immortal. Well, that's a totally different can of worms on that. But nonetheless, I understand how some people have reacted to the term, but I still use the term, and I'll continue to use the term. But again, here is Israel alienated from God through sin, violation of the Torah, and a new covenant would be made for them when they are reconciled, when they're restored to the land. They're outside of when they are outside of the land, they're dead. Isaiah chapter 27, 9 and following, 10 and following, Yahweh spoke of Israel, and he says, has he, Israel, been struck as he has, or has he struck Israel as he has struck those who struck him? In part by sending her away. And some translations render it as, has he, that is Israel, been slain as those who killed him or struck him have been slain? Well, in part by being sent away. So here is a fantastic demonstration and definition of death from the perspective of Isaiah. Israel was slain by being sent away. And as you pointed out a while ago, same identical concept in Hosea. Mm-hmm. Identical. Now, here's, since we're talking about resurrection per se, but again, ladies and gentlemen, resurrection cannot be separated from the New Covenant temple. Because where's the New Covenant temple focused? On the New Covenant, in the new land, i.e. the new heaven and the new earth. And so when you see the interconnection, you know, I had a study one time with a guy. He was known for quoting 100 passages or more. And he said that the way he studied was he'd go to the Strong's Unabridged Concordance. He'd look up a word, and he would memorize every single verse that used that word. Well, that's amazing that he could do that and that he did that. That's not necessarily a good practice of exegesis. You're not developing a hermeneutic that way. You're just simply saying, well, this verse uses that word, this one and this one and this one and this one. Must be the same thing. Must be identical, when that's not necessarily the case. Only proper exegesis and proper hermeneutic can do that. So what I'm pointing out here is this concept of the new covenant and new temple go hand in hand, just like Torah and temple went hand in hand. You can't separate Torah from temple. Therefore, you cannot separate the new covenant from the Messianic temple. So, William, when someone would say, and again, as Thomas Ice and others do, someone would say, well, you know, the promised new covenant has not been established. What's your response to that?
Well, if you know, they're saying the promised new covenant has not been established, they're basically saying Christ has not come. That's one thing that they're saying, because, you know, if you take Isaiah 49, he was to be given as a covenant to the people.
Right.
And the essence of the covenant is Christ himself, and vice versa. So that would be a denial of Christ coming from that perspective. You know, this cup is the New Testament in my blood, which is shed for many for the remission of sins. And so he affirms that that is the New Testament, the new covenant from that perspective. To say that as well is to say that the old covenant is still in force, that it has not been fulfilled, because that was the promise that was made. And, you know, as you alluded to earlier with Steve Gregg and others, basically separating their eschatology from the writings of Paul, which Paul said that he spoke no other things than those which Moses and the prophet said would come. So again, that's the other aspect of claiming that there is, the new covenant is not in effect.
And, one of the most amazing things to me that Thomas I said in regard to this new covenant not being established yet, and I actually corresponded with Thomas Ice privately about this issue because I was so stunned. I didn't know if he would even correspond with me privately or not. I didn't know if he would answer any questions about it, but he did. He was very gracious in doing that. But although the new covenant has not been established, men today are receiving the benefit of that new covenant in Christ. So it's like, wait a minute. So the new covenant has not been established, but we are receiving the benefits of that non-existent covenant. How in the world does that work?
I'm not sure. I thought for a moment you were going to go the route of sort of inaugurated, but not established in the sense that established had to do with making it stand, which is an approach that many of them take. But his saying that it's not even here, and yet they're receiving the benefits of it, that just I can't see how that computes at all.
To me, that's sort of like saying, now, Don, when I'll put it like this. Now, William, I'm going to put $10 million in a bank account. Ha ha ha. I'm going to put it, and you're going to get it when I die. But now it's not there yet. I haven't deposited yet, but you're going to receive the benefits of it. How do you receive the benefits of money that's not deposited and I haven't died? This is what I like to use the term argumentum ad desperatum. It simply makes no sense. So, in fact, I wrote a little booklet, a little small book. It's not a booklet, but a little small book, The New Covenant, Fulfilled or Future. And I have to say, I have received incredible feedback on that book. It really surprised me that it sells on Amazon, it sells on Kindle and what have you. And it is consistently one of the best selling of my titles. And I would suggest what that means to me is it's that dispensationalists are reading that little book and being impacted by it. And I've had, pardon me, oh yeah, El Chico. Had El Chico for lunch without my Prilosec. But what that says is that people are beginning to see, and people have responded to me. I've received countless emails from people who have read that little book who said it literally changed their life. And folks, if you want to get a copy, it's on Amazon and it's on my website, either one. So you can take advantage of that. But again, we have to see how interrelated the concepts are of Ezekiel 37. If you believe, ladies and gentlemen, if you believe that the gospel is God's new covenant that he promised in Jeremiah, that he promised in Isaiah 55. And by the way, let's not forget this. The new covenant is the marriage contract. It's not something unrelated to God's fulfillment of his promises to Old Covenant Israel. In Hosea chapter 2 and verse 18, the Lord said, now remember, this is after or at the time of his divorcing the 10 northern tribes and saying to the 10 northern tribes, I am not your husband. You are not my wife. Write them a bill of divorcement. And yet God looked down the stream of time to the last days. And he said, the time was going to come in which I will call you into the wilderness, and I will speak kindly to you there in the valley of Achor, and I will make a covenant of peace. Sounds like Isaiah 37. I will make a covenant of peace between you and the birds of the air and the beasts of the field. And verse 19 and following, I will betroth you again to me. I will betroth you to me in righteousness. I will betroth you to me forever. And so here's the promise of the new covenant. And I've got to say this, William. I've been developing this concept that the new covenant is the marriage contract. I know you know that. I'm not saying anything that you don't know, obviously. But one of the things that I have been contemplating and looking at more closely is how that concept correlates to Colossians chapter 2, 14 to 16. You know, everybody talks about, well, the first covenant nailed to the cross. Well, that's not what the text says in the first place. So God is saying that one covenant was passing. Don't let any man judge you in respect of new moons, feast days, and Sabbaths. That's clearly the old covenant. That's the marriage contract between God and Israel. And that's illustrated, by the way, in the feast days. I mean, you know that. A lot of people don't. And especially a lot of brethren in our former fellowship of the churches of Christ. They have no concept about the relationship between the old covenant and God's marriage with Israel as expressed through the feast days. They just don't get it. Feast of Trumpets, powerful marriage motif and concept there. So here we have this marriage motif through covenant, and Colossians is talking about the time of the passing away of the old covenant through the fulfillment of the new moons, feast days, and Sabbaths. What would that mean? The bringing in of the new covenant in fulfillment of the old. But this time, the new covenant is not just exclusively with Israel and Judah. All men of every nation are invited to come into that new covenant, which God made with them.
Yeah, so, another, or go ahead. Did you finish?
Well, I'm just saying that Colossians chapter 2, it seems to me, needs to be viewed through the prism of the marriage contract.
Yes. That covenant concept and, God entering into a covenant with Israel is very clearly brought out in Ezekiel 16 as well.
Oh, yeah.
And the correlation with tabernacle motifs in that chapter, tabernacle, marriage, covenant, all within that same context. And so that's very, very important. And that's the wedding garment, the clothing, the tabernacle that's involved there. And that's what ties 2 Corinthians 5 and these chapters we're talking about, 2 Corinthians 3 through 6, with 1 Corinthians 15, is that wedding garment of the tabernacle that people want to see as flesh, human flesh, and it's not. But that's very important in talking about that covenant relationship between God and dealing with the tabernacle and dealing with, as you say, Colossians 2, that's the old marriage contract, and he's transforming from that one or divorcing that situation in order to enter into and consummate the new.
Yeah, you almost cut out there for just a second.
Oh, sorry.
But sorry. No. I think we got it all in there. Yeah. So anyway, once again, the concept here of Ezekiel chapter 37, covenant, restoration, covenant, resurrection. In the land, new covenant of peace with Messiah, the Scion of David. Well, William, the great question, it seems to me, is justifiable then. If we have the new covenant, and if Jesus is king, ruling on the throne of David, which of course dispensationalists deny, would that not demand, therefore, that the Messianic temple has been established?
Yes, it would demand that. And it would also demand, even though we mentioned it a lot, but I know what's in the back of a lot of people's mind is, he says in the land.
Yeah.
And so where's the land? Of course, if you got the temple, you got to have the land, but the land now is Christ. And so what was in the land then, in terms of the physical land, when we get to the Messianic temple and that which is, in the realm of the spiritual, as these prophecies are fulfilled, Christ now becomes the land. Of course, he's the temple and the covenant and everything else when you really look at it, because everything is summed up in him. But that's also how we should see the land. And that's another reason why people can't see the fulfillment of these things, because they're still focused on dirt. And so they'll never get it as long as that's their concept. And that's what dispensationalism drives them to as well.
Exactly. Well, we are absolutely out of time this evening. I want to thank you for joining us. Been great to see you again. Great to have you back on the program. We'll certainly do it again in the
Thanks for
very near
having me back.
future. So good night and God bless.
All right. Good night, everyone.
All right, man. That was good. I like that. Had a good time.
Yeah, so did I.
I think Jan's got maybe some supper fixed for me. So
All right.
say hi and give Leora our love. We'll do the same with Jan. Good night.
Okay. All right. Good night.